The Word in the Sword Psychic and Psychological Warfare in the Age of the Internet, Chapter 2, Part 1. The Master and Margarita. The next morning, I couldn't wait to get to class. All morning and through class, I kept thinking about propaganda lessons from my teacher, Natalia Olegovna, as the students called her with her first and middle name, as done in professional settings in Russia. When class ended, I lingered behind and waited for the rest of the students to leave. Then I asked, "I was wondering if you could teach me how Russian propaganda is made," I asked, directly and to the point. "Propaganda is," she said, pausing, then drawing out the next word for emphasis, just as the nondescript man had done on the street the day before. "Hard. So I've heard," I said. "But this is why I wanted to study Russian in the first place. I wanted to experience Russian propaganda and learn how it's made. This is why I'm here." "Okay," she said, convinced I was serious. "I give private lessons at my home for 300 rubles, which amounted to $10 per lesson at the time." This blew my mind. I could learn the secrets of Russian propaganda for $10 a lesson. I had no doubt about it. "Okay," I said, and we set up a time next week to start the lessons. I arrived at my first lesson right on time. Natalia Olegovna lived in a Soviet-style apartment block. She buzzed me through the front door and opened the door to her apartment just as I arrived up the stairs to her third-floor apartment. She used the opportunity to teach me the customs for going to a Russian's home, starting with how to greet each other, then to take off my shoes at the door. She asked for the payment up front and told me this is customary in Russia. Then she showed me to her living room and offered me some tea. Her apartment was modest but nice and well kept. It had an air of sophistication that one would expect in the home of a professor at an elite university. We both sat on the couch, drinking tea and making small talk for a few minutes before we got started on the lessons. "What do you think propaganda is?" she asked, opening the lesson. "Well, mainly lies, but lies that make you feel something," I responded. "Propaganda can be lies," she said with a slight hint of disgust in her voice, "but lies don't make the best propaganda. The goal is to only tell little lies, or lies of no consequence that simply drive your propaganda forward." I looked confused and said, "But communism was evil. It led to so much suffering. Didn't the propaganda just cover that up to make people think it was something else?" "People actually believed in communism before," she replied. "The propaganda wasn't initially meant to be a lie. People outlined the future they saw in their mind, that they felt in their heart, and that they wanted to share with others to make it into reality," she said with a hint of passion in her voice before turning a bit sour. "It failed. It failed not because the propaganda wasn't good. In fact, the propaganda was excellent. It moved us all when we were kids, before we knew the political realities of the world. We were so good at propaganda that our leaders, rather than fix our system when problems arose, simply relied on creating propaganda to sell us on how we all wanted it to be rather than how things actually were, if that makes sense." Natalia Olegovna paused and looked intently at me to gauge whether I understood and followed along with what she said. I noticed similarities between her conversation style and that of the nondescript man I met on the street. Not only did they explain things well, but they kept checking in with me to make sure I understood what they communicated. I would notice this about most Russians with whom I had deep discussions going forward. It gave credence to the Russian spies' claim that learning Russian in Russia would teach me to speak and listen with the heart and make me a better communicator, and, in other words, develop my psychic powers. "So you really believe that communism was the better way, better than capitalism?" I asked pensively as an epiphany set in. "Sort of," she replied with a sound of regret in her voice. "The problem with our propaganda is that we all knew it was propaganda, so as we got older, we would realize it was just a bunch of empty promises and we would secretly hate it. But we couldn't openly denounce state propaganda, so we turned to sarcasm and satire. We wouldn't directly challenge the propaganda, but we would hint at our disgust with it, and others who felt the same way would understand our gallows humor." Natalia Olegovna reached for a book as she said in a lively manner, "And this brings us to your first lesson in propaganda, which is to read a part of this book here." She handed me the book, and I read the cover in Russian. "The Master and Margarita," it said. I had never heard of it, but I could tell by the excited way she spoke that she really liked the book, and I really valued her opinion as a professor, so I looked forward to learning about the book. She continued, writing propaganda in a vacuum is actually quite simple. You just envision your goals, then you write them down clearly for other people to read, and, if they agree with it and like it, pass it on to others, and so on, she said as she made circles with her pointer finger. However, your dreams and goals do not exist in a vacuum. They have to contend with other people's dreams and goals, and they will fight against your propaganda in some way. The opposition to your propaganda is called censorship, but in America we have free speech. Censorship is illegal unlike in the Soviet Union, I said naively. Censorship takes many forms. Part of the art of suppressing knowledge is the ability to censor something invisibly. For instance, in America you can legally say that the CIA killed JFK. However, there is social pressure not to say this publicly, because you'll be labeled a conspiracy theorist, which is another way to say you are a troublemaker against the system. Society will ostracize you, therefore you don't say it. This is a form of censorship. She paused to give time for this to sink in. I looked around her apartment as I had an epiphany. I thoroughly enjoyed discussing conspiracy theories and never thought about the fact that I had to carefully choose the people with whom I would discuss them. There were very few people who would discuss anything labeled as a conspiracy theory, which remained taboo for most people. It slowly sunk in that censorship did exist in America, just in a more covert fashion. It's not just America, she said, breaking the silence. Governments have learned that when you ban a book, people have a desire to read it. Social pressure works so much better because even if people do read it, they can't openly discuss the material if it is not socially acceptable. The concept of policing language and ideas was started in the Soviet Union by Lenin and Stalin, who called it political correctness. You see, communism didn't work from the get-go. They originally tried to get rid of all the laws and customs of the Tsar and create a new society that would resolve the problems that existed under the Tsar. Natalia Olegovna paused for a moment, then cocked her head and asked, "Can you tell me what you think communism is?" I started to answer, but then stopped. It embarrassed me to have to admit that I didn't really know how to define communism. Here we had fought a Cold War against communism, yet they didn't really teach us what our enemy believed. I guess I don't really know, I said sheepishly. Isn't it when nobody owns everything and everybody's equal? I don't fault your schools for not teaching you communism, she replied. The only way to teach communism is to actively spread communist propaganda. The idea sounds good to everyone, especially young, impressionable students who don't have life experience to foresee the problems that would arise with getting rid of private property. She took a deep breath, asked rhetorically, "Where should I start?" then went on. For starters, private property isn't something like your toothbrush or an individual home. That's called personal property. Communism sought to share ownership of the means of production, factories and such with all, so that bosses wouldn't exploit workers. In order to abolish private property, society needed to make big changes. A lot of changes. Communism, in a nutshell, is proposed to be achieved through the creation of what's called a new society, where we abandon traditions and create a new way of living. The Bolsheviks believed that this could be achieved with propaganda, which they called agitprop for the Department of Agitation and Propaganda. They created trains and a traveling show to go throughout the country to spread propaganda and teach Soviets how to adopt new ways of living and working. How to be a good communist, in other words, she said, making air quotes. As the citizenry learned this new way of living, the new society would simply arise and the Soviet Union would achieve communism. Whatever that looked like, no one really knew. Long story short, they didn't get much right, so they constantly had to update their propaganda in ways that were often contradictory to the old propaganda. The Bolsheviks didn't want the citizenry discussing these discrepancies, so they needed a way to. She paused for a moment for effect, then continued. Censor, she said, in a forceful voice for emphasis, people's speech. At this point, it started to make sense. I nodded my head to let her know I followed along, and she continued. This is where political correctness came in. Stalin was editor of the state newspaper Pravda, which means truth, she said, chuckling. On a side note, there were two newspapers in the Soviet Union called Pravda and Izvestia, or Truth and News, respectively. The newspapers were filled with nothing but propaganda, so we didn't take them seriously. We had a joke that said, in truth we read no news, and in news we read no truth. I chuckled at the joke, then she said it in Russian, and I understood my first joke in Russian. Then she went on. As editor, Stalin learned that he could control people's conversations simply by dictating what was politically correct and what wasn't. People would censor each other if they engaged in what Orwell called wrong think by simply pointing out that something wasn't politically correct. This trained people to avoid saying things that could get them called out, leading to the most insidious, yet invisible, form of censorship: self-censorship. We have political correctness in America, I said. Hillary Clinton really pushed it in the 90s. We made jokes about it, and it kind of went away because we saw it as annoying. It's been in America for a lot longer than that, Natalia Olegovna declared. Lenin and Stalin decided that political correctness was the best way to subvert America, so they brought professors and members of the media and Hollywood to the Soviet Union for a visit where they taught them about political correctness. Then, when they returned to America, they started to spread it. Rumor has it that many of them disappeared, she said with emphasis, in order to keep the operation a secret. Now let me ask you, knowing this, do you still believe Senator McCarthy was lying? This question struck a nerve. In fact, my teachers had taught me that communists hadn't infiltrated the U.S. government, but this didn't bother me as much as the fact that I so easily and uncritically believed it without ever pushing back. This opened Pandora's box in my mind as I started to ponder other lies I just accepted as fact without proper skepticism. I guess not, I said, sort of embarrassed. They taught us that he was lying as a matter of fact. No one challenged the teachers, and I, myself, never even thought to do that. That's called indoctrination, she replied in an understanding tone. Most countries are aware that early state education is indoctrination, but somehow you Americans, you don't see it as such. Somehow, your government makes you believe that Russians have better propaganda when ours is more obvious, while America's is completely hidden from the populace. That's the sign of good propaganda. She paused and rocked back and forth a bit, then smiled and said, It's a bit ironic that you came all the way from America to Russia to learn about propaganda when they do it better in America. As this sank into my mind, I recalled a joke a Russian told me when I told him I came to Russia to study propaganda. He said, a Russian and American were sitting next to each other on a flight to New York. The American asks the Russian, Why are you going to America? To study propaganda, the Russian replied resolutely. What propaganda? The American asked. Exactly, the Russian exclaimed. I sat there and thought of the joke and felt naive. Then explained, but you can't study propaganda in America. People don't talk about it much or even think of what it actually is, and the classes that are given take a political stance on it or focus on the parts of speech. I even read Edward Bernays' book Propaganda and found a better title for it would be Manipulation. It explained how to use public relations to subvert and coerce people to act against their own personal interest. But I want to create propaganda in a way that's obvious, that people knowingly see as propaganda, so that they too can join in writing it, and we'll have propaganda wars that lead to a better and brighter future for all. I don't want to use a person's psychology against them, as Bernays did using the knowledge from his uncle, Sigmund Freud. I don't want to write capitalist or communist propaganda. I want to find a common thread through the ideologies and create what I call unity propaganda. Natalia Olegovna smiled and sighed. That's refreshing, she said. I can see that in you, which is why it's going to be such a joy to teach you what I know about the subject. As I told you before, propaganda is hard. You aren't going to just learn from me, then go out and create good propaganda. You have to live it. You have to experience it in order to be able to speak from the heart so that it will move others to adopt your vision for the future. You're a bright boy, so you're capable. But just take this as a warning. if you go down the path to writing propaganda, it will consume your life, overtake the path you see for yourself, and you'll wind up in places doing things you never planned nor imagined. You'll see the world differently than everyone else, and even the people around you. The people closest to you will agree with the masses that you've become mad, as the reality in your own head is different from the reality the rest of the world sees. What you say and do will make sense to you and you only, until others adopt the vision laid out in your propaganda. But be warned, success isn't a given. There's a chance your alternate reality, your propaganda, never makes it out of your own head and into someone else's. And in that case, you'll forever be remembered as a delusional crazy man with big dreams that never went anywhere. Which leads us to this book, she said, holding up her copy of The Master and Margarita. We'll get into this in your next lesson. But just to show how this lesson ties into that book, the story is about the devil coming to Moscow in the 1930s. But no one is allowed to believe in the devil because the Soviet Union was atheist. An author is writing a story about Jesus, but the censors won't allow him to write it. He points out that a big black cat who came to Moscow with the devil was causing carnage throughout the city, but while the cat was real, people ignored it. So the author checked himself into a mental hospital where he decided to stay rather than live outside amongst so many lies that heavy Soviet censorship wouldn't let him correct. At the time, I couldn't foresee how this lesson foreshadowed my life. My professor warned me, just as the Russian spy had as well, but I continued headfirst into the study of propaganda along the long and winding road which would lead me to test my own sanity and to question reality itself. With that, the first lesson ended. We got up and walked to the door. I put my coat and shoes on, and Natalia Olegovna spoke many well wishes for me as I walked out the door. She always ended by saying, "Shesliva," Poka, which means good luck, goodbye. My view of propaganda changed dramatically after that first lesson. Beforehand, I had thought that I would learn a bunch of tactics to manipulate people, as we believe propaganda to be in America. Leaving that meeting, I understood propaganda much differently, as an extension of what the nondescript man had told me on the street. Propaganda simply spoke from the heart, trying to alter the course of events into the future. It could be honest or it could be lies. That depends on what lies in the heart of each propagandist. The week between the first and second lessons seemed to last forever, as I processed what I had learned and looked forward with great expectation to diving into The Master and Margarita, a book that would wind up changing my life, second only to the Bible.